Hi, I'm James.
And I'm Anthony.
And this is Words and Numbers. Coincidentally, when the indictment against Donald Trump was released, James and I were spending the week with historian Rob McDonald, constitutional scholar and lawyer Clark Neily, philosopher James Stacey Taylor, and economist Howard Baetjer. Each night, the six of us would gather around a campfire and discuss interesting topics. As the indictment is timely, interesting, and controversial, we decided to bring along microphones and release our evening's conversation as a Words and Numbers episode. As with all our episodes, the conversation is unrehearsed, and each person's opinion represents his own, not those of the institution of his employ. Please forgive the background noise of the fire crackling and dogs barking. At several points, if you listen closely, you'll hear squeaking. Those are the resident flock of guinea fowl. To make room for the extended conversation, this week we forego the quick hits and the foolishness of the week. We hope you'll agree that regardless of one's take on the topic, the whole business involving Donald Trump qualifies as adequate foolishness.
The thing that bothers me about this, though, is it's so easy for Republicans who already feel as if the system is stacked against them, and with justice, they have that feeling, to point at other examples of similar cases. And
David French, you know him?
I know his name.
He's very respectable. He's a conservative. He has a really good column. He confronts this point. He's like, that's fair. There is something of a double standard here. But actually, when Comey declined to indict Hillary Clinton, he said, I couldn't find a precedent where we've ever gone after a high-ranking official for this, what we've uncovered so far. But if there were this plus, and then he kind of listed a few things like intentional, or they had actually handed stuff to an enemy, and the last thing he listed was obstruction. That may or may not cut any mustard with you.
My concern is not that his situation is the same as Hillary Clinton's,
Right.
or Joe Biden's, or Pence's, or whomever's. My concern is that many people in America will believe that he is not being treated equally under the law and that he is being hounded because he is...
So there's a conundrum here, and David French's column really does a nice job of articulating it, which is that is true, but the conduct that is documented in the indictment is so brazen. We could argue that maybe they should never have gone down this road in terms of like trying to initiate a legal process to get these documents back. But once they did, and somebody engages in such brazen efforts to obstruct the investigation, it would have been a dereliction. The sin of not pursuing it would have been worse. I find that entirely persuasive.
So you're saying the optics are bad?
I hear Clark saying something stronger than that.
I'm saying the optics are bad. I'm saying that, how much can this country take? At a time when people feel as if Republicans are given unfair treatment by Facebook and until recently Twitter and...
So, Rob, something I'm not hearing from you, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but you're right. We don't need this. And there is one person who is more to blame than anyone else.
Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, all he had to do was just comply with a lawful subpoena. Once they found out that he had it, all he had to do was be like, yep, my bad. Here it is, whatever, and it all would have gone away.
But certainly his lawyers would have said those words to him.
I have no doubt that we are going to find out that they did.
But what's going through his head? Why would he do this?
I mean, have you not gotten to know him in the last 6 years?
For the past 40 years.
He is a clinical narcissist. My suspicion is that this may be the first time that he's ever been involved in a legal process that he couldn't fundamentally warp. For him, everything's a game, everything's a negotiation, everything's a question of who's willing to push it harder and further to the edge. He's been involved in a hell of a lot of litigation in his life, but your ticky-tack litigation, with contractors in a New York state court. I'm sure all kinds of shenanigans work in a New York state court when you're involved in a civil lawsuit over a few $1 million. And I think he's committing a classic mistake, which is to fail to appreciate that there may be a difference between being involved in litigation in the New York state court system and the U.S. Department of Justice.
Yep.
Now, that being said, you know who the judge is that's been assigned, right?
No.
Eileen Cannon. She's a Trump appointee who presided over the litigation over the warrant-related stuff when they served the warrant. Same judge. Ken White, he goes by the name of Popat. I don't know if you ever heard of that, but he's a former prosecutor who's a really hardcore criminal defense lawyer and First Amendment guy. One of my folks sent me a screen cap of. He's off of Twitter, unfortunately, but he's on whatever Mastodon. And they showed me a thread where he said, basically, if this judge wants to throw the case for Trump, she can, and there's not a thing we can do about it.
So let's pursue that. assuming she's Trump sympathetic. This case goes
She
before
presides
her.
over it.
Right. She throws it in his favor, and that's the end of it. He can't be retried.
So she sandbags the prosecution. She either grants a verdict of acquittal over the jury, which a judge can do,
Right.
or she just sandbags the prosecution so thoroughly that it's not possible to win.
So that outcome...
Wait, pardon me. This would go to a jury and she could overrule the jury?
Yeah. So a judge can grant a verdict of acquittal even if a jury convicts.
Is that standard law?
Yeah. But it hardly ever happens. It's not a thing judges typically do.
But in terms of the welfare of the country, that would be a far worse outcome than Biden pardoning him.
Oh, yeah.
With the pardon, the assumption is he was guilty, that we're now going to sweep this all under the rug.
Well, he's been credibly accused, let's put it that way.
Right.
And we're just going to avoid the hassle.
Right, but if she throws it, he's clearly guilty in people's minds.
In some people's minds.
In
I
some
think other
people's
people
minds.
feel like justice was done.
Right.
Yeah. We're talking about Donald Trump and one of his less qualified appointees, which is really saying something. I would not be surprised to see her get a Supreme Court nomination if he were to be reelected.
Wow.
I don't think there will be an explicit quid pro quo, but I think they both probably speak a similar language that doesn't necessarily ever need to be articulated.
Do you think he thought far enough ahead that he would have located in her district?
No, and DOJ didn't have to bring the case there.
Is it possible that she would decide against him and let a jury conviction stand?
Let me rephrase your question if I could. Is it possible that she'll play it straight? I think is what you're asking.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, it's possible. Do I think it's likely?
What odds?
80-20 against. I think it's also 80-20 against that she steps in a way that is overt, where it's unmistakable. But think about a referee. Think about a college football game, Michigan versus Ohio State. Everybody on the officiating crew is Ohio State grad. As long as the teams, they're reasonably evenly matched, they wouldn't have to do anything too overt in order to affect the outcome of the game. Mm-hmm. And my guess is that that's where she'll be. There'll just be persistently dubious pro-defendant rulings. Incrementally, they might add up to enough. But, like those DOJ lawyers are not dumb. So when they not only filed in that district, which is called the Southern District of Florida, they checked the box that they were going to be in the West Palm Beach division, which each district is subdivided into divisions. They knew they were picking her backyard.
They picked her backyard?
Yeah, I don't know how many judges there are in that division, but they definitely knew they were making a choice that would make it statistically, if not likely, then at least highly plausible that she would end up presiding over the case. They want to have a bulletproof case. The most relevant conduct that they're charging occurred in Florida.
Yeah.
Very little of the conduct occurred in D.C. Maybe the only thing that occurred in D.C. is when he loaded up the U-Haul, or had it loaded up. And that would give them an appealable issue. And I think they're really trying to minimize appealable issues.
Isn't it also that, there's going to be a jury, right?
If either side wants a jury, then it's a jury.
The concerns that I have about this maybe are concerns that, to its credit, the government has about this.
Well,
And so if they try this in South Florida, where the likelihood that members of the jury will be not hell-bent on convicting President Trump no matter what,
right.
can you imagine a D.C. jury? I'm guessing it would have a very different sort of partisan...
Yeah, the prosecution in this case would rather be in front of a D.C. jury. But, the Sixth Amendment requires that a criminal case be tried in the state and the district where the crime occurred. Prosecutors have a lot of leeway if the activity occurred in multiple jurisdictions, but not very much of what they charged in the indictment occurred in D.C., almost none. I feel pretty confident that they fly-specked everything that went in that indictment. I would guess there's nothing in there that they can't prove, either through recording, documentary evidence, or anything that requires the testimony of a witness and doesn't have some other form of objective support. I'll bet they've got 3 or 4 people who will all say the same thing and say it credibly.
So how could the judge torpedo that?
Trials are funny things. It's all kinds of opportunities. It's like, it's like a football game. How sometimes offensive linemen will hold when they don't need to.
Yeah.
There's just all kinds of opportunities to sort of nibble away and sandbag, and also jurors pick up on the judge's attitude. Judge can exhibit a lot of attitude. So the Sixth Amendment requires a public jury trial. The argument I'm making in this op-ed that I'm writing is that public should be understood to mean broadcast. We should all be able to see every federal trial, and we should definitely be able to see this one. The only way you get to see this trial if you take off 3 weeks and you get to the courthouse at 2 a.m. every day, stand in line to get a place. Come on. There's no good reason why a case like this shouldn't be broadcast, and there are a lot of really good reasons why it should. And one of those reasons is so all of us can keep an eye on this judge.
Yeah.
It's concerning because these people are all political, and I'm sure she's thinking to herself, what are the odds I could get impeached? And right now, not great. Because think about what an impeachment would entail, right? There's going to be people in the House and the Senate who are like, way to go, great American, if she throws the case.
In terms of historical precedent, this is the first time a president or former president has been indicted on federal charges. Is that right?
Yep.
It's not the first time a presidential candidate. If I'm not mistaken, Eugene Debs was a candidate for the presidency while he was in jail.
While he was in jail.
Yeah. I think he was running as a socialist.
I read something today that said President Grant got arrested for driving his horse-drawn carriage too fast. While he was president, paid a $20 fine. And then he became friends with the African-American officer who arrested him. But, look, the next 6 to 9 to 12 months are going to be absolutely mortifying. As I mentioned earlier, I would say I'm about 80 to 90% sure that there's going to be an indictment in Georgia. Called the Georgia Secretary of State. It was recorded. He called the Georgia Secretary of State, told him, I need you to find 12,000 votes.
Well, that's public knowledge.
There are some things that are public knowledge, but they almost always find something and they present it to the grand jury. I could virtually guarantee you we'll hear things in that investigation you don't know.
Uh-huh.
But again, I'm sure if you charge someone for different crimes often enough, you'll eventually win. And that's how it's going to seem to a whole lot of people.
Yep.
It's going to seem like these are targeted prosecutions. His central claim about the 2020 election is that it's rigged. I think what he means is that there were irregularities as far as voting machines and people cast their ballots and they weren't counted, or people fraudulently submitted ballots and they were counted. But the reality is that a lot of Americans understand is, in many ways, beyond the vote count, it was not fair, right? It wasn't like there was an even playing field between him and President Biden. It's not as if when the New York Post released its story about Hunter Biden's laptop, that got the attention that it deserved to get based on the facts of the case. That was
We can't go back in time and relitigate all that stuff. We just can't. I'm not disagreeing with you.
No, I know, but I'm talking about people are going to be really convinced that this is essentially banana republic
So
tactics.
two things are true. A significant cohort of those people, if Donald Trump beat somebody to death on Fifth Avenue, would say, well, I heard that person shouldn't have been here in the first place. And also, Obama has killed people at wedding parties with drones, so there's a lot of precedent for presidents killing people who shouldn't have been killed.
Right.
They would rationalize it until the cows come home.
Yeah.
So I'm not lying awake at night worrying about what they think, because there's no facts you could ever present to them that they would change their mind about Trump. I'm not going to let them be a millstone around our neck, that we have to allow Trump to get away with anything, because otherwise they will take it amiss and feel like they're being singled out or that there's unfairness.
I do think it's worth thinking about how this shapes the political climate within the country, which
Well,
I
that
think
was
is
okay.
already
So I was
pretty
going to
precarious.
add, but this is not beating somebody to death on Fifth Avenue. There is some basis. Hillary Clinton should absolutely have been charged. She got a free pass, and it was disgraceful what a free pass she got.
In exactly the same sort of situation.
No,
as a
not
candidate-
exactly the same sort of situation.
No, but as a candidate for the presidency.
But that's not the relevant analogy. Donald Trump's obstruction of justice was orders of magnitude more brazen. Reasonable people, I guess, could differ. I'm not sure they can, though. I think that matters a lot.
Did he destroy evidence?
What's that?
Did he destroy evidence? She did.
But she did it in a kind of a more elegant way, where she had somebody who was willing to take the fall for her and be like, well, I did it on my own, and blah, blah, blah. I have stipulated that she should absolutely have been charged. I think Trump was more brazen in his obstruction. Partly because the system is antagonistic towards Trump, so he had to be more brazen, whereas in the Hillary case, the system was basically helping her along. Like, hey, Hillary, here's your hard drive back. Normally we would hold this as evidence, but why don't you take it back? And if something happens to it, wouldn't that be too bad?
I mean, you're agreeing with me. I mean, it just seems as if there's not an even-handed application of justice.
I'm not sure I'm agreeing with you. I'm standing by my point that the failure to prosecute here was a travesty, and there is a discrepancy. But I am also saying that I don't think that then entitles Donald Trump to get away with anything.
Well, I don't think it entitles him to get away with anything.
Well,
But I mean, Joe Biden had classified documents in his locked garage next to his Corvette. I guess that's still under investigation, and we'll see how that pans out. But
they all get free passes, and all of those free passes are revocable, and there's often not a lot of rhyme or reason about when they're revoked and when they're not. And it's not as systematic as you suggest. It is, in large measure, arbitrary. It's relationships. It's who you know and what your relationship was going back, and also the relevant decision maker's estimation of your chances of one day being their boss again.
right.
It's all of this. And but it's not just blue and red. It's that you don't rise to the level of being able to make these kinds of decisions unless you are basically a morally compromised person. So yeah, I decry that. But it's not, the blue team always gets away with it and the red team doesn't. They all get away with it from time to time.
If you guys don't mind, it would be so great for me to know, because I trust you to tell me, what should Hillary have been charged for?
She had a private server. She was not holding paper documents like Trump. She was holding electronic documents.
Democrats. Well, I could make it worse. She set up a private server and did all of her State Department business through a private server that was not rated for, the necessary security.
And not using her government email address.
That's right. So she was violating open records requirements, but most importantly, a Secretary of State is handling highly classified electronic communications, and all of them were going through an unsecured server.
And James Comey, the FBI director, said that there was not just a chance, but I think
Certainty.
he said
It's a certainty.
A probability.
No, it's a certainty.
No. A probability that foreign governments could have and probably did.
I'm telling you that whatever he said, he was dialing it back. It is a certainty that hostile intelligence services were reading the traffic coming across that server.
Her classified documents, according to Clark, were seen by foreign adversaries.
Well, why was she doing it?
And they're electronic, so they're much more vulnerable.
Why was she doing it? Because she's a Clinton, first of all, and Clintons just lie and dissemble. She's above it all. She wanted to be president, so she wanted to make sure that she would be able to curate her performance as Secretary of State. She's in control of the stuff on her private server, but if it was on government computers, she would not be able to pick and choose what kinds of things get produced. If there was some very sensitive situation, she would want to make sure that no one would ever see the documentation of it.
Sort of like a point of disparate treatment of her versus Trump. Everyone who works for the federal government knows that when you conduct official business, you use your official government email account.
Yep. Well, heck, you do is at West Point.
Yeah. So everyone who's communicating with her, including many government employees, realize that she's in violation of the law, or at least of whatever regulation applies to this.
Yep.
And then
most of them are convinced she'll be president one day, so you shut your mouth.
Yeah. So they start the investigation, and she bleach bits it. When
she
it's
didn't,
revealed
but somebody
that,
did.
When it reveals that this...
I don't know. I'm not an electronic information specialist, but basically, when you delete something, it doesn't disappear. It just gets shoved off to a part of the hard drive where it resides until it gets displaced. But there are programs you can have that essentially goes through and just essentially resets everything and that's what that's called bleach bit.
And when she testifies, she plays dumb and she acts as if they...
I wiped it with what, a towel?
Yeah.
Yeah, right. It was so much worse even than that. They allowed some of her assistants who happened to have law degrees but were not practicing lawyers sit in on her questioning as if they were her lawyers so that they could then later assert attorney-client privilege. It was a setup. It was so grotesque.
And then there was a meeting on the tarmac between
Bill
Comey
Clinton
and Bill Clinton.
I forgot about that. Right.
What's the Attorney General? She was the Attorney General at the time when there was an investigation going on, and she met with the president of a high-level subject of an investigation for 45 minutes behind closed doors on a tarmac of LAX. It was grotesque. It was awful. The thing is, that's the way the game is played.
But again, as far as like perceptions of an unfairness, Trump is involved in both of these, right? She's a presidential candidate in 2016. She is running against Trump. This is the summer of 2016. This is the fall of 2016.
Yep,
and they rig it against Trump.
Yeah.
And now again, people are going to say they rig it against Trump.
But I don't care I just don't care that much what people say because
I think
this time they are wrong.
Maybe this time they are wrong, but of course it's not just this time, because if what you're considering are people being targeted because of their politics.
But see, Rob, that's the thing I'm saying. I don't think so. It is partly that, but most of the outrage here is...
Are you concerned about disparate impact in terms of prosecutions and jail time and things of that sort?
Of course, but that's not this.
It seems like there's a pretty clear disparate impact between Democrats and Republicans.
I
it seems like if you're a Democrat, you basically get the nod and you're not going to be held accountable. And it seems like if you're a Republican, you are. And, that may or may not be true, but it's not crazy for people to believe that it is true. And when you believe that the government is weaponized against a major political party...
You keep trying to make a case that I don't think you can make. I think there is something to what you're saying, but I think the rot goes deeper. The real rot here is that, generally speaking, people who either have reached a certain level of prominence in government or are perceived to be likely to reach that level of prominence are given a free pass to really do almost anything.
Right.
And what people are bitching about, I think, here is like, well, why did Trump's get revoked? And that's just not... That doesn't cut much mustard with me. Like, nobody should get a free pass. And yes, did the Clintons get a free pass? Yeah, they did. But so did plenty of Republicans. You got a free pass.
Can you summarize quickly for me what the deal is on Hunter Biden's notebook that I heard about constantly?
Yes,
and I have no idea what the accusations are.
Hunter Biden has absolutely committed federal felonies, no question about it. The most obvious one is that he filled out this form to purchase a handgun, and one of the boxes you have to check is whether you're an illegal drug user, and he is absolutely an illegal drug user. Any of us who did that would already have been indicted and convicted, and they've been tiptoeing around that. The laptop is more crumbs about how he's managed to be on some very lucrative corporate boards involving industries that he has no idea about, earning millions of dollars to just essentially have the Biden name on a
For China and Ukraine.
For China and Ukraine.
For Chinese firms and Ukrainian firms? Or
Throwing millions of dollars at the Biden family, including Biden grandchildren who aren't even old enough to be on a board.
He gets these foreign firms to throw money to the Bidens? Is that what you said?
Huh? They throw money at shell corporations that are owned by other shell corporations that ultimately funnel the money to the Bidens, but functionally, yes. Hunter Biden's electronic filing cabinet that includes videos of him with whores while doing drugs in hotel rooms, setting up shell corporations and cashing checks from Burisma and other Ukrainian petro companies. It's bad.
And this should be followed up on and is not being followed up on?
Well, it depends how confident you are that Merrick Garland has concluded that there's no need to appoint a special prosecutor because the Department of Justice that is ultimately answers to President Biden has no conflict here and can be depended on to conduct this investigation in the characteristically fair-minded and even-handed way that DOJ does things, which is, if you can't tell from my sarcasm, a giant load of horseshit. Let me say, Rob, I know I've been kind of pushing back on you a lot. This, to me, is actually the stinkiest thing right now.
Mm-hmm.
The Biden family is up to their necks in foreign money. All or nearly all of it almost certainly corrupt.
And yesterday, and maybe it's completely coincidental, but in Congress, didn't someone allege in specific terms a $5 million payment from...
Yeah. So if we're thinking about the same thing, the FBI apparently has a memorandum memorializing an interview with somebody who claims there was something pretty close to a $5 million cash payment to a Biden. But it's secondhand. It doesn't look super reliable. But it's certainly the kind of thing that if you had it in your possession, you would go hammer and tongs. If you were a conscientious law enforcement organization, you'd be going at it hammer and tongs. And there's no question that DOJ is slow-rolling this investigation.
And it's all of this is so embarrassing because on both sides, all of this is super banana republic.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And it really is.
Yeah.
That we have reached a point where the sitting president is under this cloud of corruption and former president and maybe future president is under this cloud.
It's kind of sad and funny at the same time, but basically Hunter Biden can't stay sober long enough to keep the lid on. He's getting millions of dollars that he hasn't earned and that he wouldn't get if his name was anything else, and the poor guy just can't stay sober long enough to keep the lid on all the funny money that's just, it's literally almost it's like he's stuffing it in a mattress and it's coming out the other side. He's just too incompetent to keep it in a bag.
But, I guess the thing that makes it all pretty unfair is most Americans are, I guess, watching ABC or NBC or CBS or...
Yeah.
And they're just not getting the full story.
That's true.
Right.
I'm not saying that there was a rigged election in 2020, but was it a fair election?
Right.
You raise a good point, and I get Clark saying about this has happened on the Democrat and Republican side, but I think you raise a good point, which is the people are going to perceive, or at least some of the people are going to perceive, that this is unfair.
Mm-hmm.
But Clark's right. No evidence would ever suffice for anything.
But then there's that, yeah.
No sooner did this happen than my Facebook feed was littered. Patriots rising.
Right, yeah.
But again, that's the point. Imagine that they do. Right? Imagine that there's some sort of January 6th again,
Right.
triggered by this. And what is that going to result in? Is that going to result in more liberty? Is that going to result in a freer internet? Is that going to result in a return to normal? Or is that going to result in a ratcheting up of the sorts of controls and an unfair playing field that I think most fair-minded people would agree currently exists? It is not good for our health as a representative government.
The problem remains, what do you do about it? Because you don't let him off the hook. He's done terrible things.
Well, unless other people have been let off the hook, right?
I'm not going down the whataboutism route. I just can't do it. He's done terrible things. He's leaned all over people to break multiple laws on his behalf.
Sure. Although, again, compared to Hillary Clinton, her case is much more damning.
I don't know that it's much more damning. It's damning.
Well, she's destroyed evidence.
I don't know that it's much more damning.
According to Comey, she's storing it electronically. It's hackable. According to Comey, it's probable that it was hacked.
I think Clark is right. It was hacked.
Yeah, well, I'm just saying what Comey has said publicly.
Right.
So in terms of the impact of what she has done, it's worse. In terms of his flagrants, his situation is worse. You know, it's sort of like if I flagrantly jaywalk, is that different than if I...
Sooner or later, we have to say no more.
Yeah, that's right.
But it's interesting how it's always sooner when it's a Republican or Trump.
Years ago, when I would have called myself a Republican, I probably would have been more outraged about it than I am now.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm just so tired of all of them at this point that I don't care.
Well, but there's this question. So they go forth with the Trump indictment and the trial and all of that. Does that increase the probability of the Department of Justice turning back to Hillary's case?
This will probably increase the probability of his nomination as a Republican candidate, and it will also probably increase the probability of Biden or whomever the Democratic candidate is.
I was young at the time, but old enough to at least partially understand what adults were saying when Nixon resigned and Ford pardoned him. And it was a similar thing of adults I knew being pissed off that Ford pardoned him, and other ones saying, no, this was the best thing, we've got to put this behind us.
It cost Ford the president.
It did, but in retrospect, it was the right thing to do. It had nothing to do with Nixon. It had to do with the rest of us.
But we all walked away knowing Nixon was filthy guilty.
My thought about it then and now is, thank God we were spared all
That's right.
furor.
But nobody...
Especially because we all knew he was guilty.
But yeah, nobody walked away saying, poor Dick Nixon got a bad shake.
Right. Or what about?
Yeah.
So the thing that's been on my mind that I actually find most concerning about all of this is I would say that my takeaway from the last 8 or 10 years is that, as best I can tell, if the FBI and the DOJ play it straight in an investigation of a high-level political person, that is, you should be quite surprised to see that. It's not as if it's like 50-50 or like, unless the wrong people get involved.
See them play it straight.
If they play it straight in their investigation of a high-level political person, that is a remarkable, which arguably they're doing right now with Trump.
Mm-hmm.
But they didn't play it straight with Trump in the initial Russiagate stuff. They didn't play it straight with Hillary. They didn't play it straight with Trump the first time.
But every time they don't play it straight, realize that they're playing it straight in the direction of one party's advantage and the other party's disadvantage.
I know that's your assertion. I'm not sure I agree with it. I would say statistically speaking, is it more often in favor of one party? I would agree with that, but not every time.
However you want to define the time span, I'm sure if you say in the past 100 years, okay, but in the past 8 years, it's clearly all going in one direction.
When the news media is monolithically of a singular persuasion, when the bureaucracy is monolithically of a singular political bent, you're going to get these kinds of outcomes. And only when the snapback is so severe will they even think twice. And I don't think they'll even think twice if there's blood in the street.
I think they would love blood in the street, because I think blood in the street, this is the thing that worries me. I think blood in the street would further increase their power and their leverage. No one was happier about January 6th than the Biden administration.
I've said this 1,000 times. Sooner or later, the people get the government they deserve. And we have the government we deserve.
Good and
Do you
hard.
really think so?
Yes.
Why do we deserve such a shitty government?
Because
We've lost the thread?
No, you don't, but we collectively do. We haven't paid any attention. When
Yeah.
we do pay attention, it's team sports. And it's not about what's right. It's about our bastard winning.
We're stealing bread out of our grandkids' mouths.
And now this is what you get. Sorry. A pox on all of them.
Just as the founders thought that America was this precarious experiment, I think it remains one. And it's marvelous that we have largely done okay. Last night, when I was talking about would President Biden, under any circumstances, pardon President Trump, if he did, that I think would be a really great outcome. Because it would do two things. It would remove any sense of grievance, and it would seem magnanimous.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that it would probably elevate another Republican so that former President Trump didn't end up being the nominee.
So I'd like to know why you think that.
If I'm Biden, I'm thinking, all right, Trump's my likely opponent. I'm going to pardon him
Right.
and let him be my opponent.
Right. Biden wins then.
I've already beat.
That's how it appears on the surface. But of course, the greatest source of Trump's strength as a Republican primary candidate is the sense that he is persecuted. Republican voters are going to rally around him.
No, that's right. That's right.
He's not persecuted.
I think that's why Rob says that lets the air out of the balloon and somebody else.
It's easier for Trump to win a split vote this time than it was last time.
I'm not so sure about that.
The problem is, if he doesn't pardon and Trump is convicted, Biden's out of the race. Biden's poll numbers are so low, he loses against any other Republican.
I don't know about that.
I think any other Republican is going to be demonized. Remember how like Mitt Romney was going to put you all back in chains and was this cruel person with a dog on his roof and the worst human being on the planet? I mean, we're talking about Mitt Romney, right? Mm-hmm. Any Republican candidate will be demonized by...
But, let's not let Mitt Romney off the hook. If America had met the Mitt Romney from that documentary that got put out a year or two after he ran, he would have walked into the office. We're so convinced that they had to behave a certain way that they never let him just show himself. Would have won, I think, had he been that person on the campaign trail. He was actually a genuinely likable, trustworthy human being.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the thing you have to keep in mind, Democrats and Republicans are minorities. It's the independents that you need. Pardoning Trump, I imagine, would garner Biden a lot of sympathy amongst those independents.
Look, it's the smart play no matter how you cut it, which is why I'm pretty sure he won't do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and that was the other... Clark and I were talking about this the other day, and somehow I can't see either him or his staff, depending on whoever it is that's actually running the White House, having the...
Somebody will get up and be like, no, intolerable, Trump has to go to jail.
Yeah, that's right.
It is a lot like Jefferson in 1800. We have the election of 1800. It's an electoral college tie because prior to the 12th Amendment, it wasn't clear that there was a ticket, at least not from the perspective of the Constitution. So every elector got 2 votes. The person who ended up gaining the most electoral votes would become the president. There should have been this organized system in place where one Republican elector was designated not to vote for Aaron Burr. But they all did the quote-unquote right thing, and they all voted for both, and so there was a tie. So under the Constitution prior to the 12th Amendment, the House of Representatives got to choose, and it was the 1798 House of Representatives that was elected at the height of the quasi-war with France. I'm not going to bore you. Whatever. It was controlled by Federalists. For 10 years, they had been told and they had been telling themselves that there was no human being on earth worse than Thomas Jefferson. That he was literally like the devil incarnate, literally the Antichrist, he was described as. Aaron Burr would be better. Anyone would be better. It took the statesmanship and the patriotism, really, of Alexander Hamilton to start writing letters to Federalist congressmen and saying, if we end up electing Aaron Burr, we're going to be responsible for all of his mistakes. If we acquiesce to the election of Jefferson, our hands will remain without stain. And if we ignore the fact that Aaron Burr is himself a really shady character, we could do real harm to our country. Hamilton wrote, essentially, Jefferson has principles with which we disagree. Burr has no principles whatsoever. It's amazing, right? I mean, like Hamilton is responsible for Jefferson's election to the presidency, his arch enemy. That's a really patriotic thing. I just wonder if we have the patriots today.
I can't name a single one that I would trust to do the right thing. No governmental system lasts forever. The government of France collapses tomorrow, and you still have France.
Right.
Germany, Italy. Well, what's the uniting factor here?
The thing that's supposed to unite us is a set of ideas.
And we don't believe them anymore.
They're not as widely shared as they need to be.
Rob, I believe our found principle as much as any human being ever has.
Right.
And I'm here to tell you my countrymen don't.
I'll say this, though, just to provide a little bit of context to your pessimism. Don't forget the Civil War, and we survived that. And don't forget the 1790s, and we survived that. This is not the most polarized time in American history.
Until the monetary system collapses. That's going to be the triggering event in my mind. Once that happens, there's nothing we can do. If you think that it's important that we remain the United States of America, balance the budget, pay the debt.
Yeah, I agree.
It's that simple, and it's becoming a mathematical impossibility to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the pain that would be required even now, and what's it going to be in 15 years?
I think the pain will be felt by politicians. I don't think the pain will be felt by Americans. I think you could probably institute a plan for scaling back incrementally.
The pain will come when the last kernel of seed corn has been handed out and there is no more.
But I don't think that's necessarily the way it needs to go.
But it is.
Well, let's hear Howie. So I'm with James on this, but I'd like to hear why you think that, you get my metaphor, right? They'll strip the thing bare, and the last kernel of seed corn gets handed out in exchange for a vote, and then the granary is absolutely bare. The two of us see that as the most likely endgame.
To me, it's a matter of the promises being made, possibly be kept, because there's not enough to go around. And so then it's sort of a question of who gets screwed how much. And it seems plausible to me that people recognize and that that's the case, but the country still sort of muddles on. But you say to, for example, you say to people like me, who are supposed to be getting Social Security, that, sorry, the checks, they're not going to be as large as you expected.
What you just articulated strikes me as a sequence of events that is not inconceivable, but it's not the most likely.
Kent and I wrote this up not too terribly long ago. In order to make it work, here's roughly speaking what would have to happen. And there's a lot of assumptions baked into this that wouldn't quite work out. And I get it. But you would have to cut all spending at the federal level 15% right now. And then you would have to hold that level for 6 years. And then and only then could you start increasing spending again, but only in lockstep with GDP. And then you might be able to pay off the debt in roughly 100 years. What are the odds that you're going to get that massive cut and the hold on the cut for 6 years? Zero. And I would say it's absolutely zero.
That's the strategy. The tactic that is most likely to succeed, I think, rather than just waiting and waiting and waiting and hoping and hoping and hoping, what President Reagan was calling for in the 1980s, a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. The thing that's nice about it, you could get the House and the Senate to agree to this because they might view it as a symbolic act. And it would be voting in favor of a balanced budget, not voting against any particular program or any particular level of spending.
Where we are right this second, you can't balance the budget. It's not possible.
Not without cutting Social Security and Medicare.
Yeah, I mean, you have to posit a level of character, comprehension, and commitment among both voters and their representatives that would be akin, I would say, to the level of will we exhibited during World War II.
And that's all the time we've got this week on Words and Numbers. Until next time, be sure to follow us on Twitter. Handles are in the show notes. Join Words and Numbers Backstage, the Facebook group where the conversation continues, and
send us email, wordsandnumberspodcast@gmail.com.
Until next week, try to be nice to one person who doesn't deserve it. Just one. And who knows, it may turn into a trend. Give it a shot. You might feel good about yourself.
You could say you tried.
You tried, that's right. Till next week, can't take it easy.
See you next week, James.